Senator Crapo.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you letting me go next and out of order because I have to run to another engagement. But with this group of experts present, I can't resist asking this one last question. There's been a lot of discussion by every member of the panel today about the fact that we have to get our deficit under control, and that we may have some differences among us as to what portion of that problem relates to overspending versus the tax code or what have you. But we now have a special committee operating, and it's working to get about $1.2 trillion minimum of additional deficit reduction from where we have already gone in this Congress. I am one of those who believes that that is not enough. And the reason I believe that is, as you know, I served on the Bowles-Simpson Commission. Its proposal would have reduced the deficit over 10 years by about $4.7 trillion. Leaving aside how you get there, the spending and the other policies, the broader picture of how far do we need to get is the question I'm asking. If you took the $4.7 trillion figure and played it out for 10 years, assuming Congress didn't get around it somehow and that it worked, even after that was all done, we had barely just kept our head above water, as I understand the facts, meaning that our debt-to-GDP ratio was about the same as it is today, although it hadn't skyrocketed like it will with no action. Our national debt was still $12 trillion or more. And the point I'm making is that it seems to me that our nation, in terms of setting a target, needs to be looking at somewhere at least in the $4 to $5 trillion neighborhood of deficit reduction now, in terms of our plan for the next decade. And I would just like to ask each member of the panel if you could quickly to react to that in terms of what you think our target ought to be, or how bold do we need to get in terms of our deficit reduction as we try to work on some of these proposals.
Senator, I think the $4 trillion is a minimum. And one of the reasons I believe that is I think that the current services budget projections are not the current services projections of the deficit are too low. And that what we do know when you look at history is that there is a tendency on the part of anybody who does budget analysis in government to be optimistic. And the problem is it doesn't work out that way all the time. And just taking a second to comment on this issue of uncertainty, one of the measures that I find very riveting is the fact that currently, if you look at non-financial corporations in the United States, usually they will spend approximately what their cash flow is. Today, they are at the lowest level of investment in long-term illiquid assets of any time relative to cash flow since 1940. The whole level of uncertainty is also reflected in equity prices in the sense that the equity premium, which is a measure of the extent of what those who issue stock require in order to sell an issue, that equity premium, according to J.P. Morgan, is the highest level since in 50 years. So that the level of uncertainty is deep. It is partly related to the tax issue, and especially the permanence issue, because you can almost argue that it's the impermanence of the tax code which creates degrees of uncertainty, which makes investment in 20-year assets very difficult to do. I mean, I used to, before I was in government, I served on innumerable corporate boards in which I was involved in making projections of long-term capital investment procedures. And I will tell you that the degree of stability of long-term tax expectations played a very important role, not in the average expected rate of return on the particular investment, but its variance. And once you start putting variance on a number of these investments, the risk premiums become prohibitive. So I think that a focus of this committee, and indeed the whole process, has got to be, for once and for all, let us get a structure of taxation which is not constantly subject to change and is not constantly subject to things such as tax expenditures, which are funding every single thing you can think of because it is more difficult to get it through the appropriations process.
Thank you. Dr. Taylor, what should our target be?
I originally estimated it would be $6.2 trillion relative to the president's first budget. I think if the Joint Select Committee gets its 1.2, there will still be about $3 trillion left to do. And what I mean by that, the amount that, if it's on the spending side, that takes spending to 19.5% of GDP. In fact, I would suggest that some of this dialogue be transformed back into discussions, because these trillions over 10 years are a little much for people out there to really fathom. But the idea of holding our spending, federal spending, to the same level it was in 2007, 19.5%, is something most people can understand, and it does add to the certainty. So I'd recommend that, but there is a long way to go. On this uncertainty, predictability, permanence, I mean, 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, when the case was being made for temporary, targeted, timely tax cuts, I testified in the Budget Committee that said, no, we need permanent, predictable, pervasive tax cuts. It created a little joking about alliteration, but that's where we come to. And you articulated very well, Senator, and I think the other position here is very important to remember.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time, but if the other three of you could quickly respond, I appreciate it.
If I remember correctly, the CBO number is that if we're on a course now which would take us to about a 90% debt to GDP ratio, I think a reasonable goal would be to get it down to 60% and stabilize it there. It would be better to have it lower. But doing that requires taking out 30% of GDP over this period of time, and that means roughly $6 trillion of less debt than is currently projected. And then you'd have to, in order to stabilize it at 6%, you'd need to get the budget deficit down to about 3% on an annual basis.
Thank you.
And I would just say the employers are ready to do their part, try to get the growth rate up a little bit, that if we're going to have a 9.2% unemployment rate, 1% unemployment rate of GDP that can't hardly get to 2%, we can't cut enough for tax, and they'll probably get ourselves out of the hole over the horizon.
Thank you. Mr. Kleinbart, you get the last word on this question.
Well, you know, CBO estimates that deficits in 2021 would run in the neighborhood of 1.5% of GDP, and that is, I think, in the ballpark of where we need to be. The trouble is that in doing that, CBO assumes the expiration not just of the individual tax cuts, but also all the business extenders. And when you add all that up, CBO is assuming $5.5 trillion more in tax revenue than we're collecting today. What's more, and this is the point that I take Chairman Greenspan to have been emphasizing, the CBO also assumes constant growth. There are no hiccups in the CBO baseline. And so if you want to build in a rainy day fund on top of that, you're unfortunately talking about some number compared to current policy in excess of $6 trillion.
Thank you.